By the time a man reaches 67, he learns something curious about respect. It rarely disappears all at once. It erodes quietly, like seawater wearing down the edge of a Vancouver pier. One careless word. One dismissive glance. One moment when someone decides they understand your entire life based on what you appear to be now. I learned that lesson on a grey Tuesday afternoon in downtown Vancouver, just after 2:15 p.m., while rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows of an office tower on West Georgia Street. The room smelled faintly of polished walnut and fresh coffee. 12 leather chairs surrounded a long boardroom table, each one occupied by people who managed numbers large enough to move markets. And yet, that afternoon, I wasn't thinking about business. I was thinking about a sentence someone had said to me 3 weeks earlier. "Let's be honest," she had told my daughter during dinner in Kitsilano. "He's a retired nobody." She hadn't whispered it. She hadn't even looked embarrassed. My mother-in-law, Margaret Whitaker, said it with the calm certainty of someone announcing the weather. The silverware had paused in my hand. The clink of ice in my water glass sounded suddenly loud. Across the table, my granddaughter Emily Whitaker, 8 years old and very observant, watched everyone carefully. "Grandma," Emily had asked quietly, "what's a nobody?" Margaret gave a small laugh. "Someone who used to matter." No one corrected her. Not my wife's sister. Not my daughter. Not even my son-in-law, who stared at his wine glass like the answer might be floating there. I remember looking out through the kitchen window toward the dim Pacific sky and thinking something very simple. People often misunderstand silence. They assume it means weakness. But silence can also mean patience. Because what Margaret Whitaker didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 weeks later, on that rainy Tuesday afternoon in Vancouver, she would walk into a room where every person at the table would stand when I entered. And in that moment, the definition of nobody was about to change. But here's what I didn't know then. The story that led to that moment had been building for years, quietly, inside my own family. And it started long before anyone stepped into that boardroom. At the time all of this began, I was 67 years old, living in a modest but comfortable townhouse in Kitsilano, Vancouver, about 4 blocks from the seawall. If you walked past the place on West 8th Avenue, you would probably assume exactly what my mother-in-law assumed. Retired man. Quiet life. Nothing remarkable. And in a way, that assumption wasn't entirely wrong. For 39 years, I had worked in corporate finance, specializing in strategic acquisitions and governance structures. My career ended at Westbridge Holdings Group, a Vancouver investment firm that quietly managed several mid-sized manufacturing companies across British Columbia and Alberta. Finance teaches you something early. Numbers rarely lie, but people often misunderstand them. That lesson would matter later. Most mornings now began the same way. I woke just after 6:10 a.m., made coffee in a slightly chipped blue mug my late wife Claire had bought in Kelowna 20 years earlier, and walked along the Kitsilano seawall while the Pacific air still carried that sharp, salty chill. The gulls were usually loud at that hour. The wind smelled faintly of cedar and ocean. My neighbor Raj Mehta, who had been a compliance officer at Royal Bank of Canada, often joined me during those walks. One Thursday morning he asked, "Richard, you ever miss the boardrooms?" I shrugged. "Not the meetings." Raj laughed softly. "But the decisions." I didn't answer right away. Because the truth was, retirement had never been quite what people thought it was for me. I had stepped away from daily operations 3 years earlier, after Claire passed away from liver failure at Vancouver General Hospital. The doctors called it sudden. Life sometimes is. But stepping away from management didn't mean stepping away from responsibility. That was the small detail very few people understood. I still held a controlling ownership position in the firm. Not publicly, not loudly, but legally, structurally, and permanently. It's funny how perception works. When people see you gardening on a Tuesday afternoon or walking slowly along the seawall, they assume your story has already ended. But here's what I didn't know then. While I was quietly adjusting to a slower life in Kitsilano, someone inside my own extended family had already decided what my life was worth. And more importantly, what they thought they could take from it. My philosophy about business had always been simple. Respect isn't declared. It's revealed under pressure. Generosity has a rhythm to it, much like finance. Small contributions early. Larger commitments when confidence grows. And sometimes, if you're not careful, generosity becomes expectation. I didn't notice when that shift happened in my own family. The first time was June 14, 2018, just after 10 a.m. at a cafe on West Broadway in Vancouver. My daughter Laura Whitaker had asked to meet. The morning smelled like espresso and warm pastry. Outside, buses hissed to a stop along the wet curb. Laura looked nervous, twisting the lid of her coffee cup. "Dad," she said quietly, "Daniel and I found a place in Burnaby. It's small, but it's close to Emily's school." Her husband, Daniel Whitaker, sat beside her with his usual polite half-smile. Daniel had always been respectful, though his handshake tended to feel distracted, like someone thinking about the next room rather than the current one. "The down payment is just higher than we expected," Laura continued. "How much higher?" I asked. She glanced at Daniel before answering. "About $47,300. I remember nodding slowly. Numbers had always felt easier than emotions. "You'll treat it as a loan?" Daniel asked carefully. I shook my head. "No. Consider it a start." Laura's eyes filled with relief. "Dad, we'll pay you back someday." They never did. But that wasn't why I helped. The second time came 2 years later, during the uncertain months of October 2020, when Daniel's small tech startup struggled after a contract collapsed. We met in my kitchen in Kitsilano, rain pattering against the skylight. Daniel spoke carefully. "It's temporary. I just need to keep the payroll running." "How much?" I asked. $26,850 should stabilize things for 3 months. I transferred the funds that evening. Daniel shook my hand with more warmth than usual. "Richard, I won't forget this." He did. The third sacrifice was larger. It happened on March 3, 2022, just after 7 p.m., during Emily's 9th birthday dinner at their Burnaby house. Balloons brushed softly against the ceiling fan, and the smell of chocolate cake filled the kitchen. Margaret Whitaker, my mother-in-law, arrived late, wrapped in a wool coat and her usual careful perfume. She had a way of scanning a room as if measuring everyone's worth. Halfway through dinner, Laura mentioned Emily's future schooling. "There's a private academy in North Vancouver," she said. "But the tuition is expensive," Daniel finished. I asked the number. $18,640 a year. Margaret gave a small approving nod. Quality education costs money. So I paid the first year's tuition. Emily hugged me tightly. "Thank you, Grandpa." And in that moment, it felt worthwhile. But I remember something else from that evening. Margaret shook my hand at the door while leaving. Her smile was polite. Her eyes drifted toward Daniel, as if he were the more interesting person in the room. "You've always been dependable, Richard," she said. It sounded like praise. Looking back, I think it was classification. But here's what I didn't understand yet. To some people, generosity isn't kindness. It's simply proof that you'll keep giving. And the more you give, the smaller they believe you are. The moment that changed everything happened on Saturday, February 18, 2023, just after 7:40 p.m., inside Laura and Daniel's house in Burnaby. Outside, a light winter rain tapped steadily against the windows, the kind of cold Vancouver rain that never quite turns to snow. Inside, the dining room smelled of roasted rosemary chicken and the faint sweetness of vanilla candles Laura liked to burn during family dinners. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. Emily had just turned 10, and the table was crowded with dishes and half-finished glasses of wine. The ceiling light cast a warm yellow circle over the tablecloth. For a while, everyone talked about small things: Emily's school project, Daniel's new contract, traffic on the Lions Gate Bridge. Then Margaret Whitaker arrived. She stepped in briskly, her wool coat still damp from the rain. Margaret was 71 then, a retired school administrator from North Vancouver, and she carried herself with the same quiet authority she must have used in staff meetings for decades. "Sorry I'm late," she said, placing her umbrella by the door. Laura stood to hug her. "We saved you a plate." Margaret sat down beside Daniel and glanced across the table at me. Her eyes lingered for half a second, not unfriendly, just measuring. Dinner continued normally for another 10 minutes. Then Daniel mentioned something that changed the tone. "Mom's friend is helping place executives at a consulting firm downtown," he said. "They're looking for experienced people, even retired ones." Margaret nodded approvingly. Consulting keeps the mind sharp. She looked directly at me. "You might consider it, Richard." I dabbed my mouth with a napkin. "I'm quite comfortable with retirement." The ice in my water glass shifted softly. Margaret tilted her head, studying me with the same expression she once used when correcting school staff. "Well," she said calmly. "Let's be honest." The room grew quieter. "You're a retired nobody now." No anger in her voice. Just certainty. My fork paused halfway to the plate. Across the table, Emily's small hand stopped moving. "Grandma," she asked quietly, "what's a nobody?" Margaret gave a small dismissive laugh. "Someone who used to matter." Laura didn't speak. Daniel stared at the tablecloth. The only sound was the steady rain outside. My throat felt dry, but I didn't argue. I simply placed my fork down carefully beside the plate. Sometimes dignity is measured by what you choose not to say. I stood a few minutes later, kissed Emily on the head, and put on my coat. "Good night, everyone," I said. Emily followed me to the door. "Grandpa, are you okay?" I smiled. "Of course." But as I stepped out into the cold February rain, something inside me had shifted. And though I didn't realize it yet, I was about to discover something far more serious than a careless insult. I didn't know yet what I was about to find. 3 days after that dinner, on Tuesday, February 21st, 2023, just after 9:05 a.m., I sat at the small oak desk in my townhouse in Kitsilano reviewing routine financial reports from Westbridge Holdings Group. Old habits don't disappear with retirement. Even after stepping away from day-to-day management, I still reviewed quarterly statements and certain personal trust accounts connected to my family finances. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the air unusually clear. Sunlight reflected off the wet pavement on West 8th Avenue, and somewhere down the block a delivery truck door slammed shut. That morning, one line in a banking report caught my eye. A withdrawal from the Whitaker Education Trust. $9,420.17. At first, it didn't seem alarming. The trust existed specifically for Emily's schooling, and the tuition payments often arrived in uneven installments. Still, the date looked strange. February was too early for the Academy's tuition cycle. I called my old colleague Raj Mehta, who now worked in risk compliance at Royal Bank of Canada's Vancouver regional office. "Raj," I said, "can you confirm something for me?" He pulled the record within minutes. "Richard, the payment didn't go to the school," he said carefully. "Where did it go?" "A consulting invoice. Whitaker Digital Solutions Limited. Daniel's company." That was the first layer. Suspicious, but explainable. Maybe Daniel had accidentally routed something through the wrong account. But here's what I didn't know then. It wasn't an accident. 2 days later, on Thursday, February 23rd, just after 4:30 p.m., I requested a full transaction ledger for the trust going back 18 months. The report arrived by secure email from RBC Compliance Services. I printed the documents and spread them across the dining table. The faint smell of printer ink mixed with the cedar scent drifting in through the window. Patterns began to appear. Small amounts first. $3,180.44, April 2022. $4,906.70, June 2022. $7,220.12, August 2022. Each payment listed as consulting services. Each routed through Daniel's company. Each taken from the account meant for Emily. That was the second layer. Deliberate. Organized. My training in corporate audit reviews made the pattern unmistakable. The dates aligned perfectly with moments Daniel had mentioned temporary cash flow issues. But the third layer came a week later. And it changed everything. On Monday, February 27, 2023, I met Raj in person at a quiet corner table inside the RBC branch on Burrard Street, just after 11:10 a.m. Raj slid a thin folder across the table. "You need to see the full structure," he said quietly. Inside were 3 documents. Authorization amendments. Electronic signature logs. A trust modification request. The signature authorizing the withdrawals wasn't Daniel's. It was Laura's. Total transfers over 18 months. $52,816.91. All redirected to Daniel's company. I looked up slowly. Raj exhaled. "Richard, they treated the trust like a private credit line." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The low hum of the bank lobby filled the silence. 3 discoveries. 1 pattern. 1 clear intention. They believed I would never notice. But here's what they didn't understand. For nearly 4 decades, my entire profession had revolved around identifying financial patterns people hoped would stay hidden. By the time I finished reviewing those documents, I wasn't angry. I simply knew exactly what needed to happen next. And for the first time since that dinner in Burnaby, the word nobody returned to my mind. This time, it sounded almost amusing. People often imagine confrontation as something loud. Raised voices. Accusations. Doors closing hard enough to shake the frame. But in my experience, the most decisive confrontations happen quietly, through institutions that operate on facts rather than emotion. That process began on Wednesday, March 1, 2023, just after 10:30 a.m., inside the offices of Palmer & Associates, barristers and solicitors, located on West Hastings Street in downtown Vancouver. The office smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Outside the tall windows, clouds drifted slowly over the harbour. Across the desk sat Elaine Porter, a senior corporate attorney I had worked with for nearly 15 years. She adjusted her glasses and reviewed the documents Raj and I had assembled. After a few minutes she looked up. "This is straightforward," she said calmly. "An authorized trust diversion." "Even with Laura's signature?" I asked. Elaine nodded. She had limited administrative authority, not transfer authority. I folded my hands on the desk. "What are the options?" Elaine spoke with the careful precision lawyers use when they know every word matters. "We freeze the trust immediately. Then we initiate a civil recovery claim for $52,816.91 against both Laura Whitaker and Daniel Whitaker." Outside, a seagull cried somewhere above the harbour. "Will that affect Emily?" I asked. "No," Elaine said gently. "The trust remains intact. The recovery action targets the misused funds." I nodded once. "Proceed." The second step happened later that afternoon. At 3:45 p.m., Royal Bank of Canada's Compliance Division locked the trust account and issued formal notice of investigation. The third step followed the next morning. Legal notice of financial recovery was delivered by courier to Daniel's office in Burnaby. That was when my phone rang. It was Laura. Her voice sounded strained. "Dad, we just received something from a law firm." I leaned back in my chair, looking out across the quiet water of English Bay. "Yes," I said. "Why would you do this?" she asked quickly. Daniel was just managing cash flow. "The funds came from Emily's education trust," I replied. A pause. Then Daniel's voice came faintly in the background. "Put me on." Laura handed him the phone. "Richard," Daniel said, trying to sound confident, "this is a misunderstanding. We were going to replace the money." "The records show 18 months of withdrawals," I said. Silence stretched for several seconds. Then came the bargaining. "Look," Daniel said, lowering his voice, "business was tight. You've done well for yourself. It's not like you needed the money." The calmness in my reply surprised even me. "It wasn't my money," I said. "It belonged to Emily." Another pause. Finally Daniel exhaled. "Margaret's going to hear about this," he muttered. "Yes," I said quietly. "I imagine she will." Before he could say anything else, I delivered the only sentence that truly mattered. "Respect isn't something you demand after taking what wasn't yours." I ended the call. The legal process continued exactly as designed. And somewhere in North Vancouver, Margaret Whitaker was about to learn something very surprising about the man she had called a retired nobody. The meeting that changed Margaret Whitaker's opinion of me happened on Tuesday, March 14, 2023, just after 2:15 p.m., on the 23rd floor of the Westbridge Tower on West Georgia Street in downtown Vancouver. The rain had returned that afternoon, streaking long silver lines down the glass windows of the boardroom. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of polished walnut and fresh coffee. 12 directors sat around the long table. Among them were Raj Mehta, now serving as independent compliance advisor, Patricia Langford, the firm's chief legal officer, and Daniel Harper, Westbridge chief operating officer. At precisely 2:18 p.m., the door opened. Margaret Whitaker stepped inside. She wore a navy coat and carried the slightly guarded expression people often have when they arrive at a meeting they don't fully understand. Behind her stood Laura and Daniel. Daniel looked pale. Margaret glanced around the room, clearly expecting to meet someone important, perhaps a senior executive connected to the legal claim. "What exactly is this meeting?" she asked Laura quietly. Laura didn't answer. At the far end of the table, Daniel Harper stood when he saw me enter through the secondary door. Then Raj stood. Then Patricia. One by one, every person in the room rose. Margaret turned slowly. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the rain tapping against the windows and the quiet rustle of chairs. Her eyes settled on me. I walked to the head of the table and placed a folder on the polished surface. "Good afternoon," I said calmly. Margaret blinked once, clearly recalculating something she hadn't expected. "You work here?" she asked. Daniel Harper answered before I could. "Mr. Whitaker founded Westbridge Holdings Group in 1998, he said respectfully. "He still holds the controlling ownership structure." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Margaret's face drained of color. Laura looked down at the table. Daniel stared at the floor. I opened the folder and slid a document forward. "The unauthorized transfers from Emily Whitaker's Education Trust total $52,816.91, I said. Patricia Langford spoke next. "Westbridge's legal division will oversee the full recovery process." Margaret's voice came out softer than before. "I didn't know." I met her eyes. "I know." For a few seconds no one moved. Then something unexpected happened. Emily, who had been waiting quietly outside with Laura's friend Natalie Brooks, peeked into the doorway. "Grandpa," she said softly. I smiled. "Yes, Emily." She stepped inside, looking at the tall windows and the long table. "Mom says this is your office," she whispered. "In a way," I said. Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you don't seem like a nobody." A few people in the room smiled quietly. I closed the folder. There was nothing more to prove. Legal matters, despite what television suggests, rarely end in dramatic courtroom scenes. Most of the time they resolve through documents, signatures, and a quiet series of consequences that unfold over weeks. That was exactly what happened in this case. By April 28, 2023, just after 11:30 a.m., the recovery process handled through Palmer and Associates, barristers and solicitors, was complete. The misused funds, $52,816.91, were fully repaid into Emily Whitaker's Education Trust through a structured repayment agreement signed by both Laura Whitaker and Daniel Whitaker. Daniel's company, Whitaker Digital Solutions Limited, had to liquidate several contracts to cover the repayment. The firm's operating credit line was reduced by Royal Bank of Canada's Risk Division, and Daniel eventually stepped down from his role managing the business. None of this happened publicly. No headlines. No courtroom drama. Just consequences. Laura called me on May 2nd, around 6:20 p.m. The evening air drifting through my kitchen window in Kitsilano carried that cool Pacific smell, salt, rain, and faint cedar. Her voice sounded tired. "Dad," she said quietly, "I should have stopped it sooner." I didn't interrupt. "We thought we'd fix it before you noticed," she continued. "Daniel said it was temporary." I stirred my tea slowly. "Temporary decisions often become permanent habits," I said. There was a long silence on the phone. "I'm sorry," Laura whispered. I believed her. Regret, when it arrives honestly, has a different sound to it. Our relationship didn't return instantly to what it had been before. Trust, like capital, takes time to rebuild. But Laura began making small changes, visiting more often, asking for advice rather than assuming she knew the answers. Daniel kept his distance for several months. Margaret Whitaker surprised me the most. On June 11th, a warm Sunday afternoon in North Vancouver, she asked if we could meet at a small cafe overlooking Lonsdale Quay. The harbour smelled of diesel boats and ocean air. Margaret stirred her coffee and spoke without her usual authority. "I misjudged you," she said. I nodded slightly. She sighed. "You remind me of my late husband sometimes. Quiet men are easy to underestimate." For the first time since that dinner months earlier, she looked almost thoughtful. Back in Kitsilano, my days settled into a simple rhythm again. Morning walks along the seawall. Occasional board meetings downtown. Weekend visits from Emily, who liked to sit in my study and ask questions about how companies actually work. Life became smaller, but it also became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is a very peaceful thing. When you reach my age, you begin to understand something most people only learn after many difficult years. Respect and love often look very similar at the beginning. But they are not the same thing. If you're watching this right now, perhaps sitting in your living room somewhere in Toronto, Kelowna, Calgary, or maybe right here in Vancouver, you may already know that feeling. The quiet moment when you realize someone you trusted has begun to see you differently. Maybe as less important. Maybe as easier to ignore. Age can make people invisible in a way youth rarely understands. But invisibility has one unexpected advantage. It allows you to see clearly. In my old profession, corporate finance, we used a concept called due diligence. Before any company invested money, we examined every document, every transaction, every risk. The principle was simple. Trust what people say, but verify what they do. That idea applies to families more than anyone likes to admit. Because love should never require you to ignore reality. If someone in your life treats your generosity like an unlimited resource, that isn't kindness. That's accounting without responsibility. And eventually, the numbers stop balancing. What happened in my family didn't make me bitter. It simply made me careful. I still see my granddaughter Emily every weekend. We still walk along the Kitsilano seawall, where the Pacific wind carries that familiar smell of salt and cedar. Last Saturday she asked me a question while watching the sailboats drift past English Bay. "Grandpa," she said, "why do people think quiet people don't matter?" I thought about that for a moment. Then I told her the truth. Because they mistake quiet for weakness. She nodded like that made perfect sense. So if you're someone who has spent a lifetime helping others, supporting children, spouses, relatives, sometimes at your own expense, I want you to remember something important. Kindness is not the same as surrender. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to protect what you built. You are allowed to say no when something feels wrong. And most importantly, you are allowed to expect respect from the people closest to you. Because in the end, life works a lot like those financial ledgers I used to review. Every action leaves a record. Every choice has a balance. The people who truly love you will stand beside you when it matters. The ones who don't, they were never yours to begin with.